I did want to talk a little bit. I was happy to see. I'm kind of, I'm a Browns fan, but I was happy to see Joe Burrow play well. It does bring to mind, Mark. And I was going to broach the subject to you. What his career would have been like had Ohio State made that decision in 2018 and gone with him over Dwayne Haskins. I think you guys have batted that around with your Ohio State people in the past, if I'm not mistaken. Have you not? On one of the Buckeye Talk?
I think it's been mentioned, but I don't know that we've really conjectured about it, had a debate or discussion about it. Go right ahead, David. It's an interesting one.
Well, here's a few thoughts. Well, first of all, as a person that's always kind of partial to the Ohio guys, I go to a lot of high school football around here, seen a lot of guys that have gone to Ohio State. I saw Braxton Miller's last game, saw Paris Campbell play in high school, so a few really good Buckeyes. But I got a chance to even see Burrow play in high school. But the thing that I would say is it's interesting how it would have changed things. Number one, who knows what would have happened with Dwayne Haskins. Obviously that year we kept Dwayne Haskins. He had maybe the greatest season a Buckeye quarterback ever had. The guy threw 50 touchdown passes and, basically pulled out a ton of games that year with some heroics against Maryland, against Penn State, and, played really well in big games that year. Had a great year. So it's not exactly like going with Haskins, didn't benefit us by getting a quarterback that had a great season. The other thing, that I find interesting is if we would have kept Burrow, we also wouldn't have gotten Justin Fields, right, Mark? Because you'd think that Burrow probably is there in 18 and is probably there again in 2019. I mean, wouldn't you think?
Sure. So then he moves on to the NFL, and Justin Fields, doesn't show up because there's an established quarterback, and then who's the starting quarterback in 2020?
Right. So that would have been an interesting thing from that perspective. Now, I do think that Noon had mentioned this when you guys were talking about this on one of the Buckeye shows that, when Burrow left Ohio State, nobody knew that Joe Burrow was going to become Joe Burrow. I mean, obviously, he had kind of a mediocre season in 2018, and then obviously had maybe as great a season, maybe the greatest season a college quarterback had, we've ever seen in 2019. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, 60 touchdown passes that year, if I'm not mistaken, right, Mark?
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see that a lot, and you certainly don't see that a lot out of the a major conference, a Power 5 guy throwing 60 touchdown passes. So, and I know that Noonan mentions that obviously he had the coaching, he was surrounded by great skill players. He's playing with his old wide receiver Jamar Chase, obviously Justin Jefferson. He had an NFL running back, the guy that's with the Chiefs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, as his running back. So he had a ton of skill player talent around him. But it's not exactly as if he would not have been surrounded with really good skilled players at Ohio State. Because remember, we had Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave as our receivers, and KJ Hill wasn't bad either. So it's not exactly like those guys are scrubs. And he would have had J.K. Dobbins as his running back. And not to mention, the offensive coaching that he would have gotten out of Ryan Day would have been halfway decent. He's done a pretty good job with quarterbacks. So I wouldn't be so quick to say that Joe Burrow couldn't have had, now maybe not 60 touchdown pass success, but I think he would have had a fair amount of success with the coaching and the players he had around him at Ohio State. Where am I going wrong with that analysis, Mark Rogers?
Well, if Joe Burrow becomes the quarterback in 2018, so we can't just dismiss Dwayne Haskins' accomplishments, as you just mentioned, and the games that he pulled out of the fire against Maryland and Penn State. Of course, the big loss was against Purdue. And I don't know that Joe Burrow, that version of Joe Burrow, who knows? We have no idea how he would have developed. He had a pretty pedestrian year at LSU. He was good, and he got better down the stretch. And they had a big game against Texas A&M, which they scored the zillion points in 14 different overtimes or whatever it was. And then the Fiesta Bowl game, he threw for 400 yards to close out the previous season going into the Heisman season. But yeah, Joe Burrow, to compare Joe Burrow now and Dwayne Haskins, there's no comparison. I don't know necessarily from a talent standpoint, but from a football acumen, work ethic, gamesmanship, gamer, all the intangible qualities, leadership, and all of that has gone the way of Joe Burrow.
Well, I actually, I would make one other point about receivers. Actually, in 18, he would have had Paris Campbell and Kieran McLaurin as his receivers.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't have been all that bad that year. So, I mean, there's no doubt he would have had the skill players around him as far as the backs and the receivers, and I think his coaching would have been good. Now, the thing about 2018 Ohio State is that defense was really bad, and we needed all 50 of those Dwayne Haskins touchdowns for us to even have the type of season we had that year. Because remember, that defense, we're talking about this defense being bad this year, and it was, but that defense wasn't very good either. So, it would have been interesting. Now, if Burrow wouldn't have had the year that Haskins did, maybe we had a mediocre year that year, could he have come back with a vengeance in 2019 on a more talented football team, which we were a better team in 19 than we were in 18. And, who knows what could have happened that year.
Yeah, well, now that it's all said and done, with no disrespect to Dwayne Haskins, he only had the one season. So, and then of course, like you say, there would have had to have been a replacement for Burrow in 2020. But seeing what Joe Burrow's accomplished and knowing what his ceiling is, not just physically, but as a complete quarterback, not that we know it right now, he's only in his second year, but as a collegiate quarterback, what his ceiling was, then I would make that trade right now. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, hindsight is what hindsight is. But I mean, the only case that I'm trying to make here is I think that as some of the people talked about, all of the elements and things around him to be successful were in place at LSU. I think a lot of those same things were going to be in place for him to be successful at Ohio State. That's all I'm really going with here. You know what I mean? Just kind of trying to make the analogy, and saying that, go ahead.
And for as great as Justin Fields became, and for as good as he was during that 2019 season, if Joe Burrow is playing that playoff game against Clemson, I think Ohio State wins the game.
Sure, I agree. And just how good would we have been in 2019 if you replace one with the other as the quarterback would have been the question. Now, I always wonder, it would have been interesting. And I think if when we talked about that 2019 Clemson game, I think if we get past that game, I still don't know. I think we could have played them better than Clemson, as I've said to you before. It depends on if Dobbins and if Fields had been close to healthy. Because as good as our defense, and that was the last good defense, because you think about it, we've actually been poor on defense 3 of the last 4 years. That was the last time we were really good on defense, was 2019. So, and you had Fields who threw 40 touchdowns, and then you had a running back in Dobbins who ran for 2,000 yards. So, that's a pretty complete team. So I'm not betting against us beating Burrow and a quarterback that throws 60 touchdowns. So, but I think we would have played them a better game than Clemson. I still say that to this day.
Yeah, I think that's valid.
Do you still feel the same way?
Oh, I do. I do. Think it was a poorly officiated and reviewed game.
Sure. And if one of 20-some plays that went against us, if any number of those plays go for us, we clearly would have won the game. Whether it be the officiating or, a couple of penalties or, other mistakes that were also mistakes by the Buckeyes in that game too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not taking anything away from Clemson in that I have never stated that Ohio State won that game or that they were ripped off. More of the standpoint that there were 4, what I call, big calls in that game that were, at least 3 of them were reviewed. So I would go through 4 calls, and they all went against Ohio State. I think trying to be as unbiased as possible, and I understand, and I make this claim all the time, I am not unbiased. No one is unbiased. That person does not exist. So, but I take myself out of it as much as I possibly can. I think that there's an argument for all 4. I don't think any of the 4 are clear cut 100%. It's not like somebody's foot stepped out of bounds and it's clear they stepped out of bounds and they called him in. They were all judgment calls, and they all went against Ohio State. But I believe that they were all more than a 50% lean toward Ohio State, meaning that I felt as though the judgment in all 4 instances, and I'm talking the Shaun Wade play, the strip, fumble, incomplete pass, the roughing the punter. I thought there was a 4th one.
Yeah, because that was a bad one because they scored a touchdown right after we roughed the punter. So that was basically like giving up 7 points off of a stupid penalty.
Yeah, I believe that all those were incorrectly called, but I don't think that they were just insanely egregious. But I thought that they were incorrectly called, and I think any Clemson fan who was reasonable doesn't need to hand over the victory, but would state that those were questionable calls. They would at least have to state that they were highly questionable.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that some fans have to know that there are some games that they come out of games winning that they were fairly fortunate to win.
Yeah.
They never might want to use the term lucky, but they might at least use the word fortunate.
Ohio State may not win the national championship against Miami more than 50% of the time. I'm willing to admit that.
I agree.
I don't know if that's accurate because they only played 1 game, but I would, if some Miami fan wanted to say we would win that game 80% of the time, I'd say, I don't necessarily agree, but I get your point. And sure, you might be right.
Oh, sure. I mean, that game took a lot of breaks. I mean, it took some turnovers. It took a great play by Maurice Claret. It took Willis McGahee's leg getting broken. It took, maybe a 4th down pass, a call that'll be talked about for forever. It took a number of different things in that game for that to go right.
There were some bad calls against Ohio State in that game too.
Oh, sure. I still feel that Chris Campbell was held at the end of regulation, and that if it was called, Ohio State would have killed the clock and won the game 17-14. But no Miami fan will ever talk about that play because it's not convenient for them to talk about that play. But
he was not only held, he caught the pass in bounds to convert the 3rd down to a 1st down.
Sure. They didn't have replay in 02, so that's why they couldn't go to it.
They blew the call in 2 different directions. They could have gone either way. Either called it a reception or called it a hold, and they did neither. And Ohio State had to give up the ball with roughly 2:50 on the clock.
Sure. Yeah. Parrish returned the punt, and that's how they ended up kicking the field goal to get it to the OT.
There was also an early Miami interception in that game where I think it was Chris Vance was running a deep post and Krenzel launched it, and the Miami defensive back basically just knocked him down, just threw him to the ground, picked the pass off.
Yeah. There were debatable calls. I mean, the gamble play always sticks out to me because, as I mentioned, that could have really secured the game and it allowed them to run out the clock. And as I say, that was also a game-changing play, in as much as the penalty in the overtime was. So that's why you can go both ways on that.